The trade partnership between the United States and Canada has historically been one of the world's most interconnected relationships. For decades, goods, services, and raw materials have moved freely across their borders, supporting jobs and industries on both sides. However, this harmony was disrupted on February 1, 2025, when the U.S. government imposed broad tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. While these tariffs were justified as addressing border security and drug trafficking concerns, their primary impact was economic. The U.S. aimed to exert pressure on Canada's economy, using aggressive trade restrictions to assert dominance and coerce concessions. The tariffs, affecting nearly all Canadian exports except for oil and energy, aimed to compel Canada into compliance with U.S. terms. However, Canada countered swiftly with its own economic measures, causing significant repercussions for American industries and challenging the assumption that the U.S. could unilaterally dictate trade terms without facing consequences. Canada delivered a decisive counterstrike with a $155 billion tariff package aimed at American exports. Unlike the broad and indiscriminate U.S. measures, Canada's response was precise and strategic. The first phase, valued at $30 billion, was implemented immediately, targeting key American industries with significant political and economic influence. The second phase, worth an additional $125 billion, was set to follow soon after, ensuring sustained pressure. This bold move marked a turning point, as Canada's countermeasures hit sectors that were not only crucial to the U.S. economy, but also politically sensitive for the current administration. Rather than merely reacting, Canada ensured its response inflicted maximum impact by focusing on industries with strong lobbying power and political clout. The goal was to turn American businesses and workers against their own government's trade policies. Despite its firm stance, however, Canada could not entirely escape the consequences of the escalating trade conflict. The U.S. tariffs inflicted significant economic harm on Canada, resulting in an estimated $2.1 billion loss across various industries dependent on cross-border supply chains. The automotive sector was among the hardest hit, as manufacturers struggled with rising costs and logistical disruption. Agriculture also faced major setbacks, particularly in grain, dairy, and meat exports. Additionally, Canada's technology sector, which relies on U.S. partnerships and investments, experienced financial strain as businesses adapted to the new trade landscape. However, it soon became evident that the U.S. was not immune to the fallout. Canada's retaliatory measures quickly took a heavy toll on American industries, proving that economic warfare is never one-sided. The U.S. had underestimated the impact of these countermeasures and was now feeling the full force of Canada's economic pushback. The effects were immediate, particularly in sectors heavily reliant on Canadian trade. American manufacturers dependent on Canadian raw materials and supply chains faced rising costs and production delays, adding to the economic strain. One of the most politically sensitive industries, American agriculture, also felt the impact of Canada's retaliatory tariffs. Duties on U.S. agricultural products, including beef, pork, and grains, made it more difficult for American farmers to export their goods across the border. This led to a surplus in the domestic market, driving down prices and cutting into farmers' profits. Meanwhile, the American automotive industry, already struggling with global supply chain disruptions, faced additional challenges due to Canada's targeted tariffs on U.S.-made vehicles and auto parts. These measures made American cars more expensive for Canadian consumers, reducing demand and placing further strain on U.S. auto manufacturers. Companies that had relied on steady exports to Canada now face declining sales and growing uncertainty. The economic strain extended beyond businesses, affecting consumers in both countries. As companies passed on the increased costs, grocery store prices rose due to the higher costs of importing food. Additionally, household appliances, clothing, and electronics saw price increases as tariffs disrupted the flow of consumer goods across the border. Frustration mounted as businesses and workers began to grasp the true cost of the trade war. The Canadian government made it clear that its countermeasures were not merely acts of economic retaliation, but a defense of national sovereignty. Canadian leaders framed their response as essential to protecting jobs, industries, and long-term economic stability. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau publicly asserted that while Canada was open to negotiating a resolution, it would not do so under threats or economic coercion. His message was firm. If the U.S. imposed unfair trade restrictions, Canada would respond in kind. This stance not only strengthened domestic support, but also reinforced Canada's determination to stand its ground against economic pressure. As tensions escalated, broader concerns emerged. Had the U.S. underestimated Canada's ability to retaliate? Could this dispute inflict lasting damage on the North American trade relationship? And, perhaps most crucially, what would be the long-term consequences of this economic standoff? Had the U.S. jeopardized its own economic stability in an attempt to assert dominance over a key ally? The economic fallout was only beginning, and the consequences were becoming increasingly difficult for Washington to ignore. While the U.S. had launched the trade war expecting to gain leverage, it was quickly evident that the strategy was backfiring. With supply chains disrupted, industries struggling, and political pressure mounting, the U.S. found itself entangled in a growing crisis of its own making. This dispute had evolved beyond tariffs. It had become a battle over economic survival, political repercussions, and the shifting balance of power between two of the world's closest trade partners. As Canada continued to escalate its response, the strain on the American economy was only set to increase. The real question now was no longer whether the U.S. could maintain control, but how much damage it was willing to endure. The U.S. would undoubtedly feel the repercussions, but the extent of the damage remained uncertain. What had initially been a strategic move to pressure Canada into submission had instead escalated into a trade conflict spiraling out of control. Economic losses, industry disruptions, and growing political fallout indicated that neither side would find an easy resolution. With tensions rising and no clear path forward, the future of U.S.-Canada trade relations had never been more uncertain. This dispute had evolved beyond tariffs, transforming into a broader economic standoff where both nations sought ways to gain the upper hand. While Canada's initial response focused on direct countermeasures through tariffs, the government soon intensified its strategy by mobilizing citizens to take further action against the American economy. One of the most impactful moves was a nationwide call for Canadians to reduce or completely halt travel to the United States. Far from being a mere symbolic gesture, this was a deliberate economic strike targeting one of America's most vulnerable industries, tourism and hospitality. The United States has long been a top destination for Canadian travelers, with millions crossing the border each year for vacations, shopping, and business. By discouraging travel, Canada directly targeted a key source of American revenue, adding another dimension to its economic retaliation. The effects of this travel boycott were felt almost immediately. Airlines and travel agencies reported a surge in cancellations as Canadians chose to stay home or explore other international destinations. Major U.S. tourist hotspots, including Florida, California, New York, and Nevada, were among the hardest hit. Florida, a longtime favorite for Canadian visitors, was especially vulnerable. In 2023, Canadians made up nearly 40% of all foreign tourists to the state, contributing billions to its economy. As the number of Canadian visitors declined, businesses in the travel and hospitality industries saw revenues drop sharply. The financial losses mounted quickly. According to data from the U.S. Travel Association, even a 10% decline in Canadian tourism could lead to over 2 million fewer trips to the U.S., resulting in an estimated $2.1 billion in lost revenue. This was not just a hypothetical scenario. Businesses that depended on Canadian customers were already feeling the impact. Hotels, restaurants, and retail stores that relied on cross-border tourism saw declining sales, while the economic ripple effect extended beyond tourism, hurting local businesses that benefited from increased traveler spending. Resorts, casinos, and entertainment venues, especially in cities like Las Vegas and Miami, also experienced a drop in attendance due to fewer Canadian visitors. The situation became alarming enough that U.S. government officials began voicing concerns. The National Travel and Tourism Office emphasized that Canadian travelers contributed more to the U.S. economy than any other foreign visitors. The economic losses from reduced Canadian tourism quickly became a pressing issue for state and local governments, forcing them to revise financial projections to account for the declining revenue. Meanwhile, Canada was not backing down and was taking additional steps to strengthen its economic retaliation. Canada aimed to ensure that its countermeasures had lasting effects by launching initiatives to boost domestic travel. The government actively encouraged Canadians to explore their own country rather than spending their money abroad. In speeches and public statements, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reinforced this message, urging citizens to reconsider their vacation plans and invest in their local economy instead. The campaign, which promoted national parks, cultural landmarks, and regional attractions, gained strong support from both the public and businesses eager to capture the redirected travel spending. Alongside discouraging travel to the U.S., Canada also took steps to limit American influence in other economic sectors. Provincial governments, particularly in regions like Ontario and British Columbia, moved to reduce reliance on U.S. imports by prioritizing domestic suppliers. The Ontario Liquor Board, for example, announced plans to remove American-made alcoholic beverages from its shelves, shifting purchases toward Canadian and European alternatives. These measures further solidified Canada's stance, ensuring that its economic pushback extended beyond short-term retaliation. The economic divide between the two countries continued to widen, with the United States beginning to experience the deeper consequences of its own trade policies. What had initially been seen as a strong negotiating tactic was now turning into a growing economic challenge, impacting American businesses and workers across multiple industries. The assumption that Canada would simply absorb the impact and carry on as usual had proven to be a critical miscalculation. Instead, the U.S. was now facing an escalating economic backlash that was becoming more severe each day. One of the hardest-hit sectors was American agriculture. Canada's tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, such as beef, pork, grains, and dairy, were making it increasingly difficult for American farmers to sell their goods across the border. As a result, surpluses were driving down domestic prices, squeezing farmers' profits, and adding to the economic strain on rural communities. Products that once moved freely into Canada were now burdened with higher costs, making them less competitive in the market. As a result, many American farmers found themselves stuck with surplus goods they could no longer sell at profitable prices. This oversupply drove domestic prices down, further reducing revenues and adding financial strain to farmers already struggling with rising operational costs. The situation was particularly severe in states heavily reliant on agricultural exports to Canada. States like Iowa, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, which had strong trade ties with Canada, saw a sharp decline in demand for their products. Farmers who had built their businesses around cross-border trade were now forced to seek new markets, cut production, or absorb financial losses. The manufacturing sector was also feeling the effects of the trade war. Factories that depended on Canadian raw materials, such as steel and aluminum, faced significant supply chain disruptions, making production more expensive and less efficient. The rising costs of importing materials from Canada left companies with two options: absorb the expenses or pass them on to consumers. Many opted for the latter, leading to increased prices for everyday goods, from cars to construction materials. The impact on manufacturing extended beyond financial strain. Companies facing declining revenues due to trade disruptions were forced to lay off workers or scale back operations, adding to economic uncertainty in already struggling industries. In some regions, frustrated workers and businesses began pressuring local representatives to take action against the escalating trade war. Despite these mounting challenges, the U.S. government stood firm, insisting that the tariffs were necessary for national security and economic protection. However, the reality on the ground painted a different picture. The trade war was no longer just about securing better terms. It had become a struggle to manage the unintended consequences of aggressive policies. At this stage, neither country showed any sign of backing down. Canada remained steadfast in its countermeasures, sending a clear message that it would not be pressured into submission. The U.S. was now grappling with a growing number of internal challenges, as industries and businesses increasingly questioned whether the aggressive trade strategy was worth the economic turmoil it was causing. What began as a dispute over tariffs had transformed into a larger economic conflict, one that was reshaping trade relationships, influencing economic policies, and even altering consumer behavior. With tensions rising and financial losses accumulating, the critical question remained: would either side be willing to make concessions, or would the trade war continue to escalate? The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences were becoming more severe by the day. As the conflict deepened, both countries found themselves entrenched in an economic standoff with no clear resolution in sight. What had initially been a tactical move by the U.S. to pressure Canada into compliance had instead evolved into a full-scale economic battle, one that neither side could afford to lose. The fallout within the United States was escalating beyond what policymakers had anticipated. Canada's strategic countermeasures, designed to target key American industries, were having a ripple effect across multiple sectors. By imposing tariffs on goods deeply embedded in U.S. supply chains, Canada ensured that the impact was widespread and unavoidable. The agricultural sector, already struggling with reduced exports, faced even greater distress. Corn, soybean, and wheat farmers, who had long relied on Canadian buyers, were now scrambling to find alternative markets. However, the transition was neither immediate nor seamless, and without a steady demand, prices continued to drop. Many farmers were forced to sell their crops at a loss, further compounding their financial struggles. Dairy and livestock farmers faced similar challenges. Tariffs on American beef and pork significantly reduced their competitiveness in Canada, leading to an oversupply in the domestic market and driving prices down. As profits shrank, many farmers found themselves in increasingly precarious positions, struggling to cover operating costs in an already uncertain economic climate. With each passing day, the economic strain caused by the trade war was becoming more evident. While the U.S. had initially believed it could pressure Canada into submission, it was now clear that the strategy was backfiring, triggering consequences that reached far beyond what had been anticipated. The financial strain was beginning to take a toll on both small and large businesses alike. Many smaller farms, unable to sustain losses, were shutting down, while larger agricultural businesses reconsidered their long-term investments. The growing uncertainty discouraged banks and lenders from extending credit to struggling farmers, deepening the crisis even further. Beyond agriculture, the industrial and manufacturing sectors were also feeling the weight of the trade war. Factories that relied heavily on exports to Canada were grappling with declining sales, forcing them to cut back on production. The auto industry, already struggling, faced additional disruptions as American car manufacturers tried to absorb the rising costs of imported Canadian parts. With supply chains in disarray and operational costs increasing, automakers had little choice but to raise vehicle prices, making them less competitive both domestically and internationally. The effects of these rising costs extended far beyond the factory floor. Consumers now faced higher prices on a range of everyday goods, from household appliances and electronics to basic grocery items. Retailers struggled to balance their pricing strategies, knowing that passing too many costs on to consumers could drive them away. The trade war, once seen as a strategic economic maneuver, was now causing widespread uncertainty, disrupting industries and reshaping the financial landscape for businesses and households alike. As the economic fallout worsened, businesses faced a difficult choice: absorb the financial losses or risk a drop in sales. For lower-income families, the rising costs of everyday goods became an especially heavy burden, further fueling frustration with the ongoing trade policies. In response to the turmoil, political pressure on the U.S. administration intensified. Business leaders, trade associations, and state officials from the hardest-hit regions called on the federal government to reconsider its stance. Governors from states with strong trade ties to Canada, such as Michigan, New York, and Illinois, publicly voiced concerns about the economic downturn. These states relied heavily on cross-border commerce to sustain jobs and growth, and the disruption raised fears of long-term economic damage. Even within Washington, lawmakers were increasingly divided. Some supported the trade war as a necessary step for economic protection, while others warned that the escalating conflict was causing more harm than good. As tensions rose and economic losses mounted, the debate over the trade war's effectiveness became impossible to ignore. The prolonged trade war between the United States and Canada had reached a critical juncture, with economic consequences mounting on both sides. While some in Washington still supported the administration's aggressive tariff strategy as a means of protecting American industries, opposition was growing. Many lawmakers and economic analysts warned that the costs of the dispute, rising consumer prices, job losses, and declining business revenues, were beginning to outweigh any potential benefits. Calls for negotiation